Hello, and thank you for your attendance to this presentation in the session on emerging topics. Briefly, my name is Ariane Virgona, and currently I am completing my PhD in Social and Cultural Psychology at La Trobe University. The research I am presenting here was adapted from my fourth-year honours thesis and was recently published in the International Journal of Intercultural Relations. The main objective of the study was to examine diversity, ideologies, and flourishing in an Australian context. Norms regarding how to interact with diverse others in society are often referred to as intercultural ideologies or lay theories about culture. Ideologies are specific to the organisation or community's social, political, and historical context and have a significant impact on behaviour and attitudes. By taking the view that a diversity ideology can influence intercultural experiences, the present Australian research aimed to understand the flourishing associations of endorsing three intercultural ideologies, namely multiculturalism, colorblindness, and polyculturalism. Multiculturalism assumes a categorical conception of culture that it suggests cultures are bound and static groups. The multicultural ideology inspires that each cultural tradition is deserving of respect and preservation through the focus on group differences. When Australia became a federation in 1901, the assimilationist white Australia policy prevailed, with the emphasis on minority groups abandoning their culture to adopt the majority. Massive migration from diverse nations following World War II saw the introduction of multiculturalism in the form of the Racial Discrimination Act of 1975. Today, more than 7.3 million people have settled in Australia since 1945, and 29.8% of the current population were born overseas. Multiculturalism is generally highly endorsed in Australia due to its emphasis on integration and its de-emphasis on hierarchical divides between majority and minority groups. Recent reports show that 85% of Australians believe that multiculturalism is good for Australia. However, recent global protests and events, such as COVID-19, have exacerbated the already groupist view of culture embedded in modern-day Australia, with the reported increase in racism and discrimination. Studies also support that intergroup competition and threat exist in specific Australian contexts. A representative sample of Australians indicated that citizens need to strengthen social integration, thus leading social scientists to propose that Australians are ready for more meaningful and deliberate intercultural engagement at the local level. Another predominant ideology that is often compared to multiculturalism is colorblindness. Although not formally introduced in Australia, colorblindness promotes the view that culture, race, and ethnicity are unimportant, and that all individuals in society should be treated the same. Colorblindness has often been compared to assimilation, in that people tend to assume the dominant group's perspective as standard, which allows racism and racial power imbalances to often be overlooked. In response, a more dynamic and fluid cultural ideology is being proposed, named polyculturalism. Polyculturalism emphasizes the interconnectedness and mutual influences between different cultural groups over time, highlighting that no one culture is a standalone entity. Examples can be found in various social cultural domains, such as social politics, entertainment, diet, and reconciliation, whereby historical interactions between cultural groups are formally acknowledged. While polyculturalism has been conflated with and contrasted to interculturalism, given the greater consideration of polyculturalism in cross-cultural settings, the focus of the paper was on polyculturalism. Distinct contributions of ideologies may form unique associations with psychological experiences, including well-being. With the goal of meaningful and deliberate intercultural engagement in mind, the question worth asking is polyculturalism associated with more positive and meaningful engagement compared to multiculturalism and colorblindness. Such psychological experiences and ideological influences often occur across a range of domains. Accordingly, we selected mediators across 3 domains, including the interpersonal, intergroup, and self and identity domains. As you can see on the slide here, ethnocultural empathy, intergroup contact, and cultural identity clarity were selected respectively. Ethnocultural empathy refers to the awareness and acceptance of thoughts and emotions experienced by those with distinct ethnocultural backgrounds. This conceptualization also measures how motivated a participant felt to verbalize and express thoughts and emotions in related to out-group injustices. Intergroup contact refers to the interactions, whether that be frequent or pleasant or cooperative, with individuals from different cultural groups. A clear cultural identity provides an increased sense of coherence in the self through increased confidence in the knowledge of a group's shared history and its norms. Flourishing, our dependent variable, is a psychological state that involves high levels of engagement with life and a strong psychological, emotional, and social connection to self and others. As flourishing and psychological well-being are positively associated with interpersonal empathy, trusting relationships, and cultural identity clarity, the mediating variables should have positive ties with flourishing. A personal endorsement of multiculturalism may also be associated with flourishing, as research from 2018 to 2020 suggests across diverse samples. Yet, there is no evidence for the link between personal endorsement of colorblindness and polyculturalism with flourishing. Therefore, the following 12 hypotheses comprised our conceptual framework and were tested. The dotted lines, as you can see on the diagram here, indicate a hypothesized negative association. So as you can see here, colorblindness was predicted to have a negative association with ethnocultural empathy, contact quality, as well as cultural identity clarity. Polyculturalism was predicted to have positive associations with ethnocultural empathy and contact quality, but a negative association with cultural identity clarity. Lastly, we can see that multiculturalism was predicted to have positive associations with ethnocultural empathy, contact quantity, as well as flourishing. Moving on to the methods, we can see that participants were recruited through social media sites, academic platforms, email databases, and the University Participant Registry. Volunteers completed the online survey via Qualtrics after reading the participant information and consent statement that explained the study's procedure and the inclusion criteria that now appeared on your screen. Together, 330 participants attempted the survey, and of these, 255 were selected. Of the 255, 78% were reported to be Australian-born, which is 8% higher than recorded by the Australian Bureau of Statistics in 2020. The remainder of the participants were reported to be overseas-born. The population sample was also highly educated, with 60.8% reporting to have a university degree. As you can see here, the scales were presented to participants in the order shown here in the table. Within each battery of questions, item order was randomized for each participant. Cronbach alphas were generally good, above 0.73, excluding the multiculturalism scale, which was at 0.65. And the mean for polyculturalism was highest, compared to 2 other ideologies compared in this study. A correlational analysis was then conducted to assess the associations between variables in our sample. The most noteworthy correlations, as shown on the slide, are that polyculturalism was positively associated with ethnocultural empathy, quality of contact, age, and level of education, and negatively associated with cultural identity clarity. There was no significant correlations for multiculturalism, aside from its negative association with colorblindness. Colorblindness, however, was negatively associated with ethnocultural empathy, flourishing, and covariates. Flourishing was significantly associated with covariates and mediators. Path analysis was conducted by structural equation modeling via M+. Variables and not latent constructs were measured. The standard indices such as chi-squared, the comparative fit index, the Tucker-Lewis index, the standardized mean square residual, and root mean square error of approximation indices were utilized. Some alternative models were tested. However, the final model presented here had an excellent fit, and the significant paths were robust. Quantity of contact was removed as it did not correlate with any of the ideologies. So overall, results showed that the association of polyculturalism on flourishing to be significant through all three of the mediating variables. No significant results were found for colorblindness and multiculturalism after controlling for covariates, which mirrors some results found in previous Australian studies. The bottom pathway here shows that polyculturalism endorsement by Australians had a decreased association with flourishing through decreased clarity in their cultural identity. This represents a decreased coherence and stability in one's understanding of a cultural group's shared history, values, and norms. The study is the first, to the best of our knowledge, to show indirect pathways from polyculturalism to flourishing. This research supports previous studies that have shown an association between polyculturalism and increased empathy, greater openness towards international friendships, and cultural mixing. Results of the study also support the associations between higher flourishing and positive interpersonal relationships and contact, more ethno-cultural empathy, and a clear cultural identity. So overall, the results of the study highlight that polyculturalism has both positive and negative implications for well-being. Specifically, polyculturalism encourages positive interpersonal and intergroup relations, but challenges one's intrapersonal relationship with their cultural identity. Future research should widen the scope of subjective well-being to investigate psychological distress and subcategories of flourishing, such as social, emotional, and psychological well-being, with a larger, more heterogeneous sample. It would also be beneficial to test this model using experimental and longitudinal methods. Future research should also explore the potential moderator effects of social cultural variables, as shown on the slide here, as the experience of ideologies and well-being would be different depending on one's cultural background and the intersection of their identities. Future research could also explore other potentially influential psychological characteristics associated with polyculturalism, including reflexivity, cultural knowledge and awareness, and cognitive flexibility that were untapped in this study but have yet been touched on in previous research. Of particular interest is the negative association from polyculturalism to flourishing through cultural identity clarity. As Australia continues to diversify, individuals grapple with many different identities, and the cultural identity clarity scale used in this study overlooked this aspect. Instead, it asked participants to focus on only one cultural group. Such results orientate attention towards the implication of polyculturalism on social cultural group membership. As of 2020, I have commenced data collection in this domain for my PhD, with the aim of exploring how intercultural ideologies impact self-categorization, multiple identity integration, self-concept clarity, and well-being. So in sum, given the positive and negative pathways presently found for polyculturalism and not multiculturalism, the psychological associations of polyculturalism merit further attention as we endeavour to increase meaningful and deliberate intercultural engagement in hyperdiverse spaces. Thank you very much for listening, and I do look forward to answering any of your questions.